Hello everyone, welcome to Leading with Agility, the show that uses the world around us to explore how leadership can be inspired by agility. I'm your host, Arif, and I'm joined as always by...
myself, your irregular host, TK.
Thank you, TK. And today, in this week's episode, we're joined by Paul Matthews. Paul is well known in the L&D community, an accomplished keynote speaker. He speaks around the world on a diverse range of topics. Many of you may not know, but he's also climbed Mount Kilimanjaro twice, crossed the Sahara 3 times, and the Himalayas 8 times. An impressive feat. And in his spare time, he's written a number of acclaimed books on L&D and founded a specialist learning software company. Welcome to the show, Paul. Thank you for joining us today.
Really great to be here. And yeah, it sounds like an impressive introduction, but it's all been good fun, a good life.
You're blessed to have had some of those experiences, I'm sure, traveling around the world and discovering all those places. Fascinating indeed. So today's episode, it's great to have you with us, and we're going to be exploring some of your thoughts on learning and the learning environment, and in particular ideas around reflection. But before we head into that, I normally ask our guests this question to kind of start off the episode, and this is around leadership. And I guess from the type of work you do, Paul, and maybe your own role leading the company that you do, could you tell our listeners a bit about what leadership means to you?
Well, through my career, I've had some really rubbish leaders and some really good ones, and that goes right back to even teachers at school, who in some ways were leaders. So it's one of those things. I've heard it called hard to define, but easy to recognize when you see it, and I think that's probably pretty common to all of us. So I think we all have an interestingly nuanced view of what to us would make a good leader for us. So it's also, if a leader is doing good by us, how are they serving us? And it's going to be somewhat unique to each person, I guess. So that's what it means to me personally anyway.
Thank you for that. And I guess in those experiences you've shared around leadership that wasn't the best, if we can put it like that, maybe what stood out for you that makes you think, yeah, this is where they went wrong, and these are the kind of traits, behaviors, or approaches that probably they should have avoided, or if I was doing that, I would do it in this way. Is there any insights you can share from that point of view?
One way I've thought about that, and I'm kind of lumping leadership and management together here a little bit, as I kind of think that two sides of the same coin. I think it's often inappropriate to split them.
Yeah.
And it's management leadership is something that you do with people or for people rather than something that you do to people.
Right.
And I think where I've had bad experiences of leadership and or management, it's because they were doing things to me without kind of my permission almost. It was something that I was on the receiving end of.
Yes.
Whereas where I was able to collaborate, to work with them, to think this is something we're jointly co-creating, that meant a lot more to me. So for me, that's something I recognize looking back. And I do recognize it when I see it being used, when I visit companies now, when I see people doing different things in the consultancy work that I do, with learning and development teams and so on. So, yeah.
That's an interesting distinction there. Something happening to you as opposed to with you, right? And I can resonate with that. I'm sure TK can. Yeah. We both can. And from the work we do as well, helping leaders with developing their skills and our ideas on agile leadership is very much a collaborative approach, taking the people with you to solve the problems rather than telling them how to solve it. So that connects quite well. We started at the episode, and I mentioned at the start today's episode, we want to talk about this idea of reflection, but let's just first talk about from a leadership point of view and developing leaders especially, what are your thoughts on reflection in a learning space, and why why is that important when it comes to perhaps developing leaders? And as you said, we can lump leaders and managers together. Why is that important, and how is it all linked together from your perspective? Let's start there.
I think reflection, something I've been saying off the conference stage for years, is there is no learning without reflection. And to date, no one's really ever challenged me on that statement. So maybe it's even true. I can't say it's true from research I've done or anything, but on making that statement to thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people over the last sort of decade, it's so if reflection is a fundamental component of people learning stuff, in other words, they're not going to learn stuff, particularly they won't learn it to the point where they will start changing their behavior or taking actions as a result of that learning, then reflection needs to be looked at as a component. So how do we generate reflection within learners? How do we do things that will enable them to reflect positively and usefully in a way? Because just reflecting about something and spinning your mental wheels about what did I do wrong? I mean, that's reflection, but not terribly helpful. So I think there's a variety of ways you can start sort of looking at reflection. And if you want to, we can dig a lot deeper into that.
Oh, we definitely do. And you've mentioned something that, I think is a challenge for many people, right? Which is just an internal critic jumping up and just thinking about why they've done something wrong. But the question is why do you think it's unproductive? What advice would you give to people to actually maybe reflect on this kind of reflection?
Reflect on this kind of... Well, you see, if someone sits in the corner wallowing in how well they did or how badly they did, it's unlikely to really improve what they do next time they try the same thing. So for reflection to be useful from a learning and development perspective, it needs to be constructive. And I think there's several different layers of reflection that come together. I built a model on this years ago, and I built it on the basis of what other people had already started doing. And I probably took it a little bit further. But I came up with the idea there's actually 5 different levels of reflection that make a difference to how people learn. And I'm talking about reflection in a learning context here. There's other types of reflection, obviously. But here I'm focusing on what might be useful and purposeful to generate when you are seeking to learn something. So I can very quickly go through those 5 levels if that would be...
Please do. And we'll actually link an article, your article, to describe these levels. But if you'd like to quickly go through them, I'm sure that our listeners will be quite interested.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, there's a blog on the website and so on. But the level 1 is just where you are almost unconscious of what's going on, but behind the scenes in your subconscious mind, there is a sort of a targeting mechanism, and you will tend to do slightly better next time if you've got a set of outcomes. So it's really an unconscious reflection, which sounds a bit strange, but it does exist. And then the next layer up is where you've got conscious reflection, which is where you're aware of the fact that you're thinking about something, an experience you had, and the third level is where you start getting much more critical and asking some decent questions about that experience. And, what happened? How could I make it better? And there are a number of reflective models, by the way. I do quite a bit of work in our software and with the NHS. And the NHS in this country is very good at getting people to reflect on something they did. And a fourth level is where what you are thinking about is going to be made available to other people. So what happens is you think, well, actually, I better think about that twice before I make that public in some way. There were some fascinating experiments done with students in a school, and it's been replicated many, many times since, where they actually posted the essays these students were doing and submitting. They posted them directly onto a blog that was then visible to the internet. And the results, students put a lot more effort in and produced far better quality material than if they were just submitting an assignment to their teacher, who would be the only person that would see it. And it transpires that when you have an audience for something, then you will think twice, you will reflect more, you will think about it in a different way in order to put a better result out there. So those who are judging will judge you better.
Makes sense.
And then the fifth level is, you've probably heard that old adage, the best way to learn something is to teach it, which is actually wrong in my opinion in terms of what we're talking about here. The best way to learn something is to prepare to teach it to someone who doesn't know much about it. Because in order to make that preparation of a lesson plan, you have to really think about it in a different way and recognize how it's different for a newbie to be thinking about it and what they will need, rather than just give them, what you would know as an expert. So it changes your relationship with the topic and the subject matter when you prepare a lesson plan to teach something.
Amazing model, Paul. And I think we'll obviously link your article, and I'm actually looking at it. There's some wonderful explanations there. And actually, for us, reflection is like the core value of leading with agility. So an agile leader always reflects. But here in the learning scenario that you've mentioned, which we're primarily focusing on, I'm wondering about one thing. Obviously, as you've described on level 5, reflecting through preparing to teach someone else is quite an important thing in the business and practice of L&D. But if someone is an L&D professional, a trainer, a training designer, and looking at your model on these 5 levels, which do you think they should care about the most? Which is the most important that you encounter in the formal learning scenarios?
That's a really good question. And I tend to suggest that people who are training designers use this model to sort of as a litmus test for their training. So given the training you are designing, how far up these levels will it push the delegates within that training? And like a classroom will push them to level 3 quite easily. And level 4 is a bit different, but level 5 is not so easy to get to often. But one way you can design for that is make sure the people that either in the classroom either have to teach it to each other, for example, is you can split them into groups and give some one thing and some another and say, right now, teach it to each other. Or delegates coming back from a training or learning experience might be required to then deliver the key nuggets and core principles of that back to their teammates who did not go on that training. So there are ways to incorporate it within learning programs. But that's when you're starting to look at learning as a program that's end-to-end, which incorporates activities outside of the classroom. And I think particularly for leadership, that's absolutely essential, because learning leadership's, you could term it a contact sport, if you like. You can't learn to be a leader from a book any more than you can learn to swim from a book. You need to have some principles, perhaps, but then you need to go out and do them, experiment with them, practice with them, and reflect, obviously, on them in terms of, well, what happened to me? How could I do it better? But also you could then say, well, I'm going to go and tell my 8-year-old son or daughter what I'm learning in my leadership program. And that's a great way to think about a topic differently. How do I explain that to an 8-year-old? And that will make you think about it entirely differently to perhaps how your trainer or an expert might explain it. And that will give you a whole new dimension or set of dimensions on the material that you are explaining to your 8-year-old. And they'll ask some damn good questions too, by the way.
Sure, imagine, yeah.
So, sorry, Paul, finish your...
Yeah, no, I'm just saying. So there's a couple of just tips and tricks on how you might bring that level 5 into a training core.
Nice. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And we recently had another guest on our show who was very much advocating for similar ideas around a learning environment that spans outside the classroom as well. Peer-to-peer learning groups and things of that nature as well. So there's clearly a push towards that. I mean, in your view, with the work that you do, and you said, this is a good model for you to assess your own, training materials against. Where do you see the biggest gap? Is it level 5? Is it elsewhere? In terms of what's missing the most when it comes to creating those impactful learning experiences that incorporate the reflection we're talking about?
I think often reflection in general is missing from many training courses.
Right.
They don't give people time. They say, well, we've got them in this room. It's costing us X £100 or whatever to have them in this room for the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're going to feed them everything we possibly can during the course of this day in training. And there's no time put aside for them to think, to reflect, to discuss. So I really think that this jug and mug approach, which is still far too common, where you just feed people lots of information in a training course, I'm much more in favor of a flipped classroom approach, where a lot of the knowledge that people might need to pull together, the models and things they might need to read about, is done outside of the training day. And then in the training day is much more about collaboration, discussion, reflection time, talking to each other about each other's reflection and what that means to them and their personal circumstances as a leader where they are functioning in their own organization and so on. So I think there's an awful lot more that needs to be done in terms of reflection during the course of a learning program, both in the classroom and beyond it, into other activities that you need to act as a wrapper around if you are talking about a classroom training, what wrapper do you need to wrap around it to enable people to think carefully about what they need before they go into it? And then afterwards to think carefully about how can I apply this for me? What help do I need? Who's going to support me doing this? Try something, experiment with it and then reflect on it and say, well, that worked or it didn't. How can I improve that? And so on. And set up all those activities end to end over a period of time that will enable them to actually make the behavioral shifts that are desired from where they are when they start to where you want them to be maybe months later. And that's all about that whole program, a lot of which will require reflection along the way to achieve the different steps along that program.
Well, the idea of the wrapper and other activities, I like that. Let's come back to that a bit later on. I want to go back to, you mentioned the NHS and the work you're doing with them, which sounds interesting in terms of how you feel they're quite effective at some of this. Would you? I mean, it'd be nice to share some stories. So, I mean, what experiences have you had in the work you've done with them that have demonstrated this the effectiveness of reflection during learning? And if you could share any insights on that, or any stories of how that's worked, or maybe what hasn't worked, I think it'd be nice for us and our listeners to hear some of that.
I think in general, the NHS has quite a strong paradigm about reflection being a critical part of all of the qualifications and certifications they do. We've got several trusts who are using our software, for example, to help them get qualified to do venipuncture, drawing blood or putting in a cannula or doing medicine administration or whatever. And at the end of each of those little programs they do on our system, there are some activities which said, now reflect on how it went for you, what's important, how will you change? So these questions are put to them to get them to stop and think and reflect. And this is very common right through the NHS in terms of how they do things. I mean, one expression I've heard them use is see one, do one, teach one.
Yeah.
Nice.
So this is if you want to watch someone, drawing blood on the ward to see how it's done, you then want to do it under supervision and eventually get to the point where you're teaching others to do that. So this is kind of how they learn a lot of these practical skills, but those skills also need a whole bunch of other theoretical stuff wrapped around them, like how to manage infection control when you are drawing blood on the ward and so on, how to reassure the patient. So there's communications and rapport skills required. So it's not just drawing blood to get the right vial in the right place and find the right vein. There's all of the other skills wrapped around that make up that whole process of drawing blood on the ward in a way that is comfortable and patient-centric and looks after the concerns they might have. And they get there by reflecting on it. So they're taught to reflect even after just doing it, saying, well, actually, how did that go for me? I think it's a strong part of the NHS culture, this whole idea of reflection.
And it's a big thing, especially in professions like that, right? Because this is how you improve the service of care. But I'm wondering about one thing, Paul, because what I've seen is, with my experience and our experience when it comes to people reflecting in various roles, especially when it comes to generations and what you can see now currently in media and social media in our lives, it would seem to me, at least from my perspective, that reflection was always hard, but it seems to be even harder now. People seem to see that they need to be really go-getters, driving things forward and not necessarily looking back as much. And I was wondering, what's your experience in terms of, has reflection been harder nowadays? Has it not changed? And how do you deal with the fact that it's hard as it is?
I think reflection's a matter of time and desire more than anything else. And I think one of the things that's stopping people doing it, perhaps as much as they might have, is the ubiquitous social media and mobile phones. So when they're on the train on the way home, they could sit there and stare at the ceiling and reflect on their day. But often they're on their phone looking at a movie or catching up with emails or doing something else. So I think, if you're commuting, that's a great time to reflect on, what happened. And really it's simple. You just say, well, I had that experience today. I had that meeting, or I had, I did that thing, or I handed that report in and this happened, or whatever. And you say, well, what did I want? What did I get? And what can I do to, give me a slightly better result next time? It's not like a complex thing, but it does mean that you are asking some specific questions. And this is the sort of level 3 reflection we talked about. It's about asking some specific questions that will be useful, rather than thinking, oh my God, I had that meeting today and I was so embarrassed myself and I feel like crap and whatever, So it's not just wallowing in what went well or what went badly. It's actually asking some constructive questions that will help. So that level 3 reflection is available to anybody almost at any time when they are, heck, we even do it when you're driving on the motorway. Not that I'd recommend it, but, you can end up passing 5 junctions and completely unaware you've done so.
Because you've been in this reflective mindset. Absolutely.
You are reflecting. You're away. You're daydreaming about stuff, which means you're reflecting. Now, whether that's useful reflection or not is another story. And I'm not for a minute saying every time you reflect, it should be useful. There's wonderful ways to daydream and reflect on a holiday and just wallow in the good times. Great. But from a learning and development perspective, reflection is a critical part of that process of developing and getting better at what you do, whatever that is.
It definitely is. And I think what we'll do is we'll give our listeners a moment of reflection by giving them a bit of a break. We'll be back soon.
We're back in December with another webinar. This time we'll be joined by Georgina Kelly, HR Networker Extraordinaire and a member of the HR Most Influential Thinker List for the past 2 years. With her phenomenal background, she'll be joining us to talk about the critical importance of peer-to-peer networks within learning and development. For more details, head to our website, scroll to the bottom of the homepage and click that registration link. We can't wait to see you there. Thank you, TK, for that segue into our break there, and welcome back to our listeners. And we were just exploring definitions of reflection. I like Paul was effectively implying daydreaming is reflection before we went through. I do like that. I'll take that one. Next time I catch myself daydreaming, I can tell myself I'm simply reflecting. So thank you for that, Paul. And now let's moving the conversation on a bit in terms of how perhaps we can go take the learning experience beyond the classroom environment a bit and perhaps create greater opportunities for reflection, not just within the classroom but outside, we touched on that earlier. Let's go through that a bit more detail. And I suppose you with the work you're doing, work that we do as well, I think we would both agree that the idea of practically testing out, experimenting, trying out whatever you learn in a classroom environment outside of the classroom is the only way you're going to develop yourself, right? And learn new skills and improve on them. I suppose similarly to what TK was saying earlier, again, is the space for that diminishing as you see it in workplaces, in organizations? Is it recognized as something important? Is it valued? How do you see that currently? Where do we think we are?
It's a good challenge, a good question. I think there are people in the L&D community who are becoming much more aware of and promoting time to reflect, time to think, time to practice, time to experiment, and then time to relearn something that perhaps they learned and then forgot, and then they need to relearn it a bit if their experimentation didn't quite work the way they were expecting. So there is a need for all of that as part of the learning process. And it's slowly getting it to people, I think, is an idea that event-based learning really doesn't work terribly well. And what I mean event-based learning, I mean an event like a one-day training event where you go and learn X, Y, Z, or a chunk of e-learning where you'd learn about X, Y, Z. Unless there's a wrapper around that to help people both get their headspace right to do it and then to afterwards do exactly the things you were talking about, to experiment, to practice that skill, to get better at it, to get feedback from it, and then to say, and I mean deliberate practice where there's a focus on improvement rather than just doing the same thing over and over and over again. So there is a need for that whole, I term it a learning workflow, which is a phrase I pulled in my book on learning transfer. I think it was a few years ago that came out now. So I've been talking about this for quite a while, is the concept of a learning workflow, which is what are all the workflow of activities that someone needs to do to get from where they are now and the way they behave currently to where they want themselves to be in maybe 6 months' time in terms of, if we're talking leadership, what sort of leader do we want to see there in 6 months' time? And what's the gap between what they're doing now and what we want to see in 6 months' time? And how do we take them through a sequence of activities to get them from where they are now to that leader we want them to be in 6 months? And of course, they need to want to take that journey as well themselves.
Yeah.
So, what are all the activities that are required in that learning workflow? One or two of which might be to attend a classroom event, for example.
Yeah, and that was going to be my challenge, which is obviously that for that to happen, it has to come from the individual as well. There has to be a desire there that they also want to get there.
There's a little bit more than that for the individual. There's actually three primary factors that need to be there in the mindset of that individual in order for them to engage with that process.
Right.
One is they need to be motivated to the extent, I want to do this. This is good for me. I want to do this. This is great.
Yeah.
The other one is what the psychologists call volition, which is about perseverance. In other words, the desire to do it is sufficient. They'll keep doing it and keep working on progressing, even if they don't quite feel like it today. It's about like going for that run on a cold morning when you don't really feel like it. It's good for you. And then the third one is what the psychologists call self-efficacy. In other words, I know that with the right support and tools and knowledge, I can do this. I am capable of getting to that desired output at 6 months' time.
Yeah.
It's something that's possible for me. Because if I don't think it's possible for me, why would I even bother starting? So those three things need to be part of the mindset of the learner going into that learning workflow.
How do you create? I mean, is that something you create? Is it something you have to have a conversation about? I mean, where does that need to come from?
Yes, you need to plug into the motivations of their motivations. Do they want to be promoted, for example? That might be one.
Yeah.
So yes, there's a marketing job to do, and it needs to be termed by and large in terms of what's in it for them rather than what's in it for the organization.
Yes.
Far too often, training courses are promoted to learners in terms of what's right for the organization. And quite honestly, a lot of learners really don't care.
No, they don't. Yeah.
Unless they're shareholders or something. They just want to say, what's good for me? What will make my life easier? What will make it, my relationships around work better and more comfortable? How will I end up being able to get home at 5 o'clock and actually be in time to put the kids to bed? So these are all the things that are important to the learner. So how do you couch your program in ways that matches those desires they have and joins the dots together? So they say, damn it, that's good. I want that. This is really. And then the other piece that comes into play there is the role of the leader in the larger organization. And leadership's crucial in learning programs, not because there's a leader at the top of the organization saying learning is good, but because that leader is leading. And what I mean by that is they are saying, this vision I have of the future is a really cool place to be, dudes. You got to be there with me. Come on, let's go. This is great. I want to be part of that. And the learner will say, yeah, me too. I want to climb on that wagon. I want to join that train. I want to be part of that. And in order to do that, there's some stuff I probably need to learn along the way to change what I'm doing, because that future is different to what we're doing now. So there's change. So therefore, I'm going to need to learn a few things. Right, I'm up for that learning because I want to be there in the future with that leader. So that's why leadership's important in a training program, is because there's a future that the delegates want to get to, and it's espoused by the leader.
Yeah, no, and that links to like it goes to any kind of change an organization's instituting, right? And the leader having to create that why. And having to make that very clear and say, look, it's that first mover thing. I'm going to go there first. I want you to come with me because there's a bright future, as you said, ahead, or there's something that we're chasing that we're going after, and I need your help and so on. So that all makes sense.
Yeah. The problem occurs where that leader isn't leading and they're just standing there saying,
directing instead. Yeah.
And it's kind of like they're saying, well, where we are is okay. And everybody will say, well, if where we are is okay, why would I need to learn anything?
Yeah. There's no need you're creating or desire, to move into something. Yeah, of course. Just going back to the wrapper point you mentioned and having other activities around. The work we do, coaching is a big thing for us, and we believe in the power of coaching as a way of assisting in that journey. Conversation, like we were talking about there, for someone going through that learning pathway, that learning journey, helping them get to that next stage. Coaching can be a big asset in that conversation. Where do you see? Where's your? What are your views on coaching? Where do you see that sitting, and does it have a place in the kind of work you describe?
I think it absolutely has a place. One of the critical success factors of a learner changing their behavior and transferring their learning into activity in their workflow is the input from their line manager. That's quite a big factor. Excuse me. And the line manager is there for 2 or 3 different reasons. They are there as a cheerleader to cheer that person on, hopefully. They are there as a coach to provide an insight into and ask some good coaching type questions.
Right.
They're also possibly there as a mentor to say, well, I've been there and this was my experience, and you might find description of that experience useful. They're also there to do things like provide opportunities to that learner to experiment and practice, but with enough risk management around that the learner can't get themselves into too much trouble or the organization into trouble when they're trying to do new things. So it's very much about so the manager's there for a bunch of things, not just some coaching. And then you may well then also have other people involved with that coaching. So you may have a subject matter expert that's available through that learner to coach them. And then in these days, you may well have a very well-trained chatbot who can provide a lot of background information, who's trained on all of the different models and things that are relevant to that training course. And they're there now, and you can talk to them with your voice and just say, hey, ask it a question, and it'll give you back some answers. So, coaching is vital in my view to learning transfer and people operationalizing what they learned in a training course and making sure it has some impact in the real workflow.
So that's an interesting one, actually. And as you've mentioned, line managers, I've been thinking, obviously, as a manager, as a leader, you have multiple roles, right? Being there as a coach to help a person reflect, but also being there as a mentor, being there obviously as someone that will evaluate. And I'm just wondering, right, as a leader, what we've seen is there's obviously a lot of responsibility on the leader themselves. And in this particular moment, on this particular role, we believe that reflection is even more important about the way you lead. So, but the challenge is, and I don't know if you would see this too, Paul, that when people are looking up to you for leadership, they're expecting you to have the answers. And over time, what might happen is you might get used to the fact that you're providing answers and people are taking it for granted, so your answers might be right. So what would you suggest? How would a reflection look like for a leader? What question can a leader ask themselves to see if they got the right bearings and if they're leading the way they, have their values to lead?
I think a leader that thinks they've got all the answers is arrogant and actually probably doesn't deserve the title leader. I think there's a level of humility required, and they can say, well, I don't know. That's a damn good question. Let's go discover the answer together. So in terms of reflection, I think a leader should be reflecting on that interaction I just had with John or Sally. How did it help them grow? And if all you did was give them an answer to a question, that's not leadership. That's just management and telling. That's doing to, not for or with. So I think it comes back to that concept of servant-centered management and leadership. How am I serving these people? And in serving them, how am I helping them grow so they don't have to rely on me so much, perhaps? So that's part of leadership to me, is helping others become leaders and filling your succession line, if for no other reason. I don't know whether that answers your question, but that's kind of where your question took me.
Well, it's true, and I totally agree with you. But I don't know if you have a similar experience, but sadly, and we've talked about it at the start, there are many people in managerial roles, let's call it that don't necessarily subscribe to this philosophy, or they haven't yet discovered it. So I'm wondering, and this is one of our jobs, actually, to help to provoke people to have these thoughts, possibly listening to podcasts like this one with you. But I'm just wondering, in your experience, because I'm always and I'm sure our listeners are interested in that too, how can one go about it? How do you provoke leaders to lead differently in this kind of way, for them to reflect and want to change?
I think it comes back to that very simple litmus test I used earlier. Am I doing this to people, or am I doing it for them or with them? And if my style of leadership is just doing it to people, now, occasionally that might be required. If the main server is down in an IT system and you've got 3,000 desktops not functioning for people, then you will tell people, this is what you do right now, do it, don't stop and think. And so there are different contexts and situations. And I mean, there's models around that for situational leadership. We know that. So there are times when you need to be more collaborative, more coaching, more mentoring as a leader. There are times where you've just got to use the JFDI philosophy. So, it depends on the context. But certainly, I think you need to encourage in leaders the idea they should reflect on the service they are providing to people and the service they are providing to the organization, because the organization is a stakeholder in the level of leadership they're providing, as are the people on their team. And it's interesting when you think about the ripples that style of leadership can cause, because people who've not experienced much leadership before look to their first few leaders as being, well, that's a model of what leadership should be. So if that's bad leadership, it kind of gets propagated through the generations of leaders, which is sad. If it's good leadership, it will help. And also, if it's good leadership, then people in a team will be probably less stressed. They will be more engaged. In general, they'll be healthier and the whole lot. So there's a ripple effect out to them and their families in providing a good leadership or management service to people. And I like the idea of that ripple effect. There's quite a big leverage available there to just help not just the team, but the families of those on the team and the villages they live in and the places they inhabit and so on. So there's a wider game afoot here, if you like, by doing it well. Leadership is such a big lever for that can be used for good or for ill, quite frankly.
Mm. Thanks for your reflections on that, Paul. As we head towards the end of the episode, I thought maybe we could switch back to some practical thoughts from you. Some of our listeners may be coming from the L&D world and are embarking on implementing a program of learning for themselves, for their staff. How would you practically advise them, or what would you say to them that they need to consciously think about adjusting to accommodate some of the ideas we've talked about today? So what would be step one and maybe step two that you think they should be doing in order to make some adjustments so that they can bring in some of the ideas we've discussed?
I think I did a podcast a while back, and it said, "What rant have you got about L&D?" So I ranted, which was kind of fun. And one of the things I said in that podcast was lack of clarity of outcomes is the root of all evil in L&D.
Okay, I think that's more broadly as well. I'd agree.
So when you're talking about what an L&D person might need to do to start introducing some of these concepts, I would say, step one is clarity of outcomes.
Okay.
And I don't mean by an outcome that 30 people did this program. No. I mean, at a behavioral level, what do you want these people to be doing? In other words, how do they need to be doing things differently in order to execute the organizational strategy differently and at a better level?
Yeah.
What are the thresholds of those behaviors? Where do you want to get to? But also, more importantly, how would you recognize those behaviors when you see them in action? And that way you can start defining where you are now and where you want them to get to. So an analogy I like to use is the sat-nav analogy, where there's 4 critical success factors. So this is also how you can look at developing your learning program. Now, the same 4 factors is you've got to know where you are now. In other words, what is the current behavioral position we're in? What's our current location behaviorally? How are people performing and behaving right now? What are they doing? Where do we want them to get to in maybe 6 months' time or 4 months' time or whatever? And how would we define and describe that end place and get clarity over that? And that's usually going to be defined in terms of behavioral shifts or what people are doing. And then you can say to the senior grown-ups, this is what we want people to do. Do you agree that when they do that, they will then be able to execute your strategy that you have? And then, so now you've got to define beginning point and an end point, which are pretty obviously also critical for a sat-nav.
Yeah.
You then need to define a set of turn-by-turn instructions to get them from point A to point B. And those need to be fit for purpose to get them there. So that's your next job, is to say, given this behavioral gap we have to bridge, what are all the things they need to do along the journey to get from point A to point B? And then the 4th critical success factor is you have to hold people accountable for actually doing those step-by-step or turn-by-turn instructions, because if they're not followed, then they're not going to get to the destination. So that, in a nutshell, is a very quick way to think about that whole journey, and that's that learning workflow, all those activities, the step-by-step things that people need to take. So think of it like a sat-nav, and you'll start thinking differently. Where are we trying to get to? And, of course, the corollary to that is, what behaviors are we trying to deliver? And that's very different to the question of what curriculum am I trying to deliver. So forget about the curriculum. Start from what behaviors do I want to deliver?
Okay.
Get clarity on that.
Thanks for that, Paul. And then the other side to that question, and then probably we'll finish today's episode, is perhaps if you are a leader experiencing some training, you may be experiencing some right now, wherever you are in your workplace, or maybe you are seeking some training. What would you be telling them about how they can improve for themselves, create their own awareness, create their own, journey for themselves of where they want to get to? What advice could you give them about how they can improve their own situation when it comes to learning and reflecting?
I think we'll probably go back to that clarity of outcomes. If I'm sitting here thinking I need to be a better leader or I need to be a better manager,
Yeah.
How do I know that? So
Right.
this is me talking to me as a person wants to develop. How do I know that what I'm doing now isn't as good as what it could be? So what do I perceive as the gap between what I'm doing now and what I think will be better? Until you have that gap and a desire to cross it, there'll be no motivation to do much. So it's about getting clarity over, well, in 6 months' time, I want to be the kind of leader who will X, Y, Z, and so on. And I will be able to do these things. I will get these reactions to the sort of things I'm doing as a leader. So it's about clarity of that journey you want to take. And only when you have that clarity of what sort of leader you want to become, will you then be able to start figuring out, well, what steps do I need to take to move in that direction?
Thank you for that, Paul. Really good insights. We've had a fascinating discussion. It's been great to have you join us today. I hope our listeners have found it equally valuable. We've learned a lot around your thoughts when it comes to improving the situation of learning and reflecting as a leader, whether it's in a learning environment or outside of a learning environment. We had a great discussion about that. So thank you for joining us. If our listeners want to find more information about what you do, then they can visit peoplealchemy.com, if I got that right, Paul, your website. Alternatively, connect with you on LinkedIn. Anything else you'd like to add to that? I think I've covered all the places to find you. Is that right, Paul?
Well, there's lots of other places, but that'll do. I mean, you can find me on LinkedIn. That's great.
Yes.
And if you want to know more about some of the stuff that we do with other organizations, then the website at peoplealchemy.com is a good place to start. And there's a bunch of blogs on there with some really useful stuff for people in the learning segment, particularly. And then the other place you can find more about me personally is my personal website at paul-matthews.com. And that talks more about my books, my speaking, the ebooks, and other bits and pieces. And again, there's a whole host of free resources to look at, videos and stuff to download from there as well. So please go and use it, make use of it, make the world a better place.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Paul. And thanks for sharing that information. Well, as I said, that's all we've got time for today. It's been a pleasure hosting you and a good conversation overall. We'll see you hopefully at our next episode next week. In the meantime, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast player. And do give us a review, a like, a follow, whatever platform you're using. And we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.